everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the CVO Live. It's my honor today to introduce you to Dr. Ronny Kohavi, Technical Fellow and VP at Microsoft and Airbnb. He is also the co author at the best selling book, Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments, a practical guide to A B testing, and also one of the people that I admire the most in the experimentation landscape. So, thanks a lot for joining me. And Mr. Kohavi, the first question that I have for you, of course, because we are in this, we are focusing on customer centricity. What does it mean at a practical level to be a customer centric and data driven company from your perspective?
Okay, well, first, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. What does it mean to be customer centric and data driven? So it basically means optimizing for the long term customer value and for the business because they're both part of the equation. Now, there's many things that people can do short term that will help the business, say, raise revenue, but they can hurt the relationship in the long run. One example is showing a lot of ads, right? So I was at Bing and we did some experiments, and we knew that when we start showing more ads on the page, when you search, then customers start to attrition, right? They churn, we lose the customer. So there's a trade off there. We need to show some ads in order to make the business work, right? This is how search works. But if you go over a certain number of ads, you start to annoy the users, then you're making a trade off that is not good for the long term. Um, if you think about other businesses, I think, Amazon is sort of treading right now on generating a lot of money from sponsored links, but the page is starting to become a little too full of them and it begins to get annoying. And so there's a question about whether they're a little bit too much on the generate revenue and hurt the customer experience.
Yeah.
Um, when you think about being customer centric, I think about features that help the customer that may not be as good for the business, but they're the right thing to do. So I'll give you one example that I love at Amazon. If you go to a book or a movie or a product that you previously bought and that's not replenishable, Amazon warns you. It says, "Hey, you've already bought this book. You sure you want to buy it again?" Now, this is to me, it's a great example of being customer centric, right? Because they could make the money. You may not remember that you bought this book 5 years ago, or maybe that you bought this uh, video or movie. But it is all about the long term relationship. That message makes you feel like Amazon cares about me. Okay. In addition, I do think that many of these cases where it's a borderline case, the business gets hurt when the customer sometimes realizes, "Hey, I've already bought this book. I'm going to return it," and therefore there's additional cost to that equation. Um, Maybe a couple of more examples that I can think of where businesses may not think about the long term. Say I'm a Marriott loyal customers. I stay a lot of their hotels, but I'm also a AAA member. And usually, if you put your AAA, uh, take the drop down for discounts to AAA, you get a good discount. But they try to introduce friction there. Every time I have to book a room, I have to re-enter my AAA number. That to me is not customer centric, right? Customer centric is when you offer me that discount. You know I'm a AAA member. You say, "Hey, don't go for the regular price. We know you're a AAA member. Why don't we default to that and we remember your numbers?" Trade-offs are hard, but I think being customer centric means optimizing for that experience so that make the customers more loyal in the long term.
Love it, and love both of your examples. You've said something very important regarding the long term customer value, right? So,
Right.
is customer lifetime value a better metric to optimize for long term success than the current purely lag indicators like the financial metric, let's say revenue, EBITDA, you name it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do believe that you have to take the long term view of the customer and the business. One example that I love to give is, from the hotel industry, partly based on my experience at Airbnb. You could define the short-term metric of conversions or revenue, right? Somebody visits, I want to measure the conversion rate. I want to measure whether I generated revenue from that visit. But that's a short-term optimization. What if I get a user to convert where I give them a very, cheap listing that looks great, but I know based on their history, they're not going to be happy with it because I've seen their bookings in the past. I've seen what they do. And one thing you can optimize for isn't just the booking, but what I think of as a happy booking, a booking where the person 3 months later, when they stay at the hotel or listing, they're going to rate it high, right? So there's clearly a minimum bar that everybody has to say you don't get bed bugs in the hotels, but some people care more about the price and are willing to take trade-offs so that the place isn't as great. It may have minor imperfections. Some people are willing to pay more, but they want that perfect stay. Maybe it's a romantic stay. They're willing to pay for more for it. And so the optimization criteria, what in my book and in my class I call the OEC, the overall evaluation criterion, isn't short-term revenue, but it's revenue plus other factors like happiness, the rating. So ideally, you try to say, I want to optimize both for my revenue, but I also want the customer to be happy so that I get penalized if the customer stays and then rates it, say, below 4 stars. Coming up with that combination is one of the toughest questions in the how you define the business's overall evaluation criterion for use in controlled experiments or A/B testing. And once you come up with that OEC, you can actually try to build models that predict that customer happiness and therefore adjust the offerings that you make to the customer.
Love it. I have a very quick side question. Do you foresee a future where companies will do experimentation, will do A/B testing, not for short-term metrics like conversion rate, but for customer lifetime value?
Oh, I already know that people are doing that, right? So the trick, and there's a section of that in my book where we highlight that the hardest problem when you start to do A/B testing is, in my opinion, that coming up with that OEC, the overall evaluation criterion, because um, it's easy to come up with short-term metrics, profit, revenue, but then short-term theatrics can hurt the long-term value of the customer. So one of the hardest things to do is to come up with an OEC that is predictive, right? And predictive not just in the machine learning sense, but causally predictive of customer lifetime value. So coming up with that OEC that says, I have to look at, as I said, customer happiness as part of the metrics I'm evaluating today. Maybe it's done through machine learning models. Maybe it's only 70% accurate, but at least you're taking into account the fact that I want to make sure that the customer is going to be happy with the transaction that they're now doing, whether it's a purchase or a hotel stay or something.
Yeah. Now that you've touched this subject, I think it's an amazing opportunity. I had the debate just today with our head of data about the fact that you can find some correlations between the NPS and the customer lifetime value. So let's say you do some experiments to improve the customer lifetime value, you do whatever kind of experiment. But in order to validate that also the lifetime value and the NPS are being affected positively, or to find a causal relationship between the NPS. Let's say our debate was if the NPS goes down, the lifetime value goes down as well. But in order to see that, you need multiple orders from the same individuals, right? So you can't
Right.
simply say this is what's going on if you are selling mattresses, or let's say slow moving consumer goods.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. As I said, coming up with an OEC that is predictive of the long term is a very, very hard problem. And what you end up doing is you have in our mind a causal model that says if I will do X and Y, the customer will be happier. So therefore, if you believe in that causal model, you then can measure short-term attributes that are predictive of the long-term value. And what you can do is run some long-term experiments to validate your causal model. So we believe that putting more ads on the search results page is going to hurt the customer experience. We actually tested that belief. We ran some experiments where we showed some user more ads, we showed some user fewer ads, and then we were able to build sort of the coefficients for how much do ads beyond a certain point hurt churn rate, uh, the ability for the customer to visit us more often, things like that. And based on that, we were able to define this long-term OEC.
Love it. So, Dr. Kohavi, you are into A/B testing for 20 years, right? So I know that you are into innovation and driving innovation through A/B testing. So, what I want to touch is a subject that you will for sure go more in depth in your upcoming course at Maven. But what I want to ask you is about the cultural challenges, right? So, what are the cultural challenges when you have, let's say, part of the organization being, let's say, future oriented and progress oriented, and the other part of the organization is, let's say, they have this mantra like we've always did things this way and it worked.
Yeah, so I do think that culture is a big problem. I think most organizations that I worked with want to be data driven. They just find the trade off sometimes hard to make, especially when you start to run experiments. They're expensive in the beginning. The org is not used to this. Running every experiment is hard. You make errors and the experiment validity is in question. The goal is to get to the point where a good experimentation platform reduces that marginal cost of running an experiment close to zero. And we've achieved it in several places. I worked at Amazon, I worked at Microsoft. The cost of running an experiment was so low that there was really no reason not to run it. Once you get into that point where the platform gives you the ability to cheaply run experiments and you get the value, which is, the scientific method, the best way we know to establish the causality between I've changed the feature and these key metrics have changed, then the org sees that value and tends to accelerate the use of experimentation over time. Now, this isn't simple. I show in my book and in my class these graphs where this can take several years, but ultimately, in most organizations that start to adopt experimentation, they see the value, they have the growth, and they achieve the sort of mantra of test everything. Every change that the organization does to the product, to the business model, is tested in one or more controlled experiments, or online, they're called A/B tests.
Super. So my last question for you is tell us a bit about the other contents of the upcoming course, accelerating innovation with the A/B testing.
Yeah, so the course is something that is based in part on the book that I wrote with Diane Tang and Yaju. Uh, it basically is a 10-hour class that takes you through 5 sessions of 2 hours that allow you to understand, I think, some of the key concepts. Some of them I mentioned here. One of them that I haven't mentioned is, and I think is key, is this sort of the humbling reality that we are often wrong with our ideas. But one of the things I do, which is fun in class, is I introduce these A/B tests, ask people to vote on A or B, and you can see that less than half the people get it right. It's a three-way vote, whether A is better than B is better than A, or are they the same. And
Mhm.
by the third question, it's like less than 10% of the class, or about 10% of the class, gets all three questions right. And to me, that's the humbling reality, right? We've shared statistics from Microsoft, from Airbnb, about how the success rate of idea is low. Microsoft overall is about two-thirds of ideas that failed. At Bing, it was about 85% of ideas that failed. And at Airbnb search, where I headed the search and relevance, we showed that for building these machine learning models, it was 92% of our ideas that didn't actually succeed in improving that OEC. So I think this humbling experience is something that everybody has to drill in, and I love showing this to real, you know, class students in the class to humble them, to show that it's hard to get the examples right. We talk a lot about the OEC, the overall evaluation criteria, and I show a lot of examples that fail to work and why they fail, so you can learn from other people's mistakes. And then I show things that work well. How do you optimize things like, a search engine or an email campaign? We talk about the classical mistakes of misinterpreting p-values. A lot of people do that. You have to understand uh, statistical power. You have to have enough users. Another topic that I love talking about is Twyman's law. Any figure that looks, interesting is probably wrong. If something looks too extreme, you hear these people saying, "Oh, I ran this test and it improved conversion rate 10 times." No, that never happens, right? You don't get that. Find what's wrong with the experiment. It could be that you have a sample ratio mismatch, and then we show these examples of how to raise the trust level of your experiments by running things like AA tests or sample ratio mismatch tests, etc. So we cover a lot in class. You this is partly based on the book, with more examples, more interactivity, more questions, which makes it a lot of fun.
Love it. So, Dr. Gohavi, while you were speaking, I got my last question, if you if you agree,
Sure.
which is, I realized while you were exposing the great contents of the course, that maybe when we are looking at optimizing the entire customer journey, so let's say for customer lifetime value, when we've started back in the days into the CRO, I mean, I've started like this. I was a practitioner from day one. But when we started, we got this data coming from the web analytics. So we were looking at the visitor behavior. Now, what I think it's lacking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we are lacking insights which are being generated from data that can be collected across the entire customer journey. So companies are sleeping on a ton of data that is not crunched, and insights are not generated, or anomalies are not generated. So when we start to experiment just for the sake of improving this type of metrics, if our data collection, let's say, is not good enough, we are not seeing this type of anomalies, like, I don't know, most of the best customers from in terms of customer lifetime value are having this type of parameters, are buying from through this channel, coming from these regions. And I think there is also a need for a better way to collect the data in order to generate hypotheses that will allow you not to be so wrong, even though being humble, it's a good thing on the long run, right?
Right. Yeah, so you're talking about the classical trade-off of, do we invest more in generating a better understanding of the customer? You can use data providers like Axiom or others to add information about the customers. Um, it's a classical trade-off. You have to pay for that. It's usually the reliability is not as high as the behavioral data that you collect yourself, right? One nice, the beautiful thing about an online experience is that everything that the customer is doing online, we can sort of collect very reliably. At Bing, for example, every time you do a query, we used to log like 1,000 attributes, 1,000 metric that we would then compute, and that's harder to do offline. But I mean, I agree with you. If you can get additional information and then show that these are helping your prediction rate, it's important to do, but there is a trade-off there. I know that some organizations try to do that, and tying that data is not easy. The reliability is low, so it's an economic question of whether that effort brings you more value than the cost of doing it reliably.
Excellent. So, Dr. Kohavi, thanks a lot for being today with us, and let us know if someone wants to follow you, where they can find more from you, and of course, we will put the link to your course in the show notes.
Thank you so much for inviting me.